Thank you very much for inviting me today, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. It's always so lovely to be in Ukraine and to be in Kyiv, the most beautiful city. And I saw it the first time in winter, and it was very cold. But now in summer, it's absolutely beautiful, and it's lovely to see you all looking happy and summery as well. And it's always a pleasure to be with you too at this time when you are resisting the Russian invasion, and well done for everything you are doing as a society to remain true and free as yourselves, as Ukrainians. So thank you for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be with civil society organizations as well. I've always had a huge admiration for civil society organizations. I find they are often more radical, more committed, more long-term, and a big part of society, so it's very important, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about this book, Humanitarianism 2.0, New Ethics for the Climate Emergency. And I'm a little nervous talking about it in Ukraine, because when I talk about it in other parts of the world and in Europe and places like that, because the book says we should care for all life, not just human life, but if we are humanitarian in a climate emergency, when the earth itself is suffering and changing and parts of the earth are dying, we have to care for all life around us as well. And people, when I present the book and I present my arguments, people often stand up and say, "Ah, yes, but what about in Ukraine? What do you expect me to tell my people in Ukraine, that they should also care about trees and rivers and birds and animals? Come on, they're fighting for their life. Surely this is irrelevant and strange idea for Ukrainian people at war." So this is the big test for me today. So I'm sitting in front of Ukrainian people in a war, and I'm going to talk about humanitarians having responsibility for nature as well. And then at the end, you'll tell me I'm either mad and they're right, or you agree a little, or you understand, maybe. But the other night when we were bombed so badly, and so many of you suffered in Kyiv, and we lost over 20 people, Kyivian people. Of course, when those bombs fall, and when they fall over Ukraine, which they do every night, they hurt people, they hurt buildings, but they blow up the environment. They kill animals, they kill nature, they pollute the air as well. So humans are not the only victims in this war. So that's what I will suggest. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Mila, thank you to Ola, and thank you to Ukraine for being Ukraine, which is great. I was working in Geneva on war, and I thought, but there's this climate emergency. We have many wars around the world, but actually our Earth is in trouble. What does it mean to be a humanitarian in the climate emergency? What does it mean if we talk about climate humanitarianism and not just war humanitarianism? And as I began to research this idea and this book, and I was funded for 2 years by 3 Red Cross agencies and 3 Caritas agencies, because I work in a Catholic college in Oxford. And so I had different funding. And I thought, what is this Earth emergency? And very soon I stopped calling it the climate emergency, because the climate is the problem, the changing climate that is creating an Earth emergency for the whole planet, the whole Earth. And we know the characteristics of this Earth emergency. We know it is going to be universal. The rivers, the oceans, the water, the skies, the forests, the trees, the food supply, the heat, the weather will change everywhere. Ukraine, Britain, Canada, Africa, Australia, Indonesia. It is a universal emergency. We also know it will be very long. We are not going to solve this quickly. And already the heat that is changing in the world has changed forever some parts of nature. So we know this emergency will be 10, 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years long. It will be a 21st century emergency. And we know also that this Earth emergency will create unprecedented changes, things we have never seen before, things we don't imagine, like icebergs melting, like deserts increasing, like sea level rising. Things will happen that we have not seen before. So looking behind us is not a guide, because humans have existed on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years, and we will possibly see now things in the 21st century that humans have not seen, that humans are not designed for. So this emergency will be unprecedented, and it is therefore an emergency for humanity and for nature and the whole Earth community. So this created a new question for me for humanitarianism. It means, how do we do life-saving in a changing Earth? How do we find life-saving harmony between humanity and nature when we work as humanitarians? And I realize this demands a new ethics, a new morality, new fundamental principles for humanitarians in the 21st century. So this book is the beginning of trying to argue for new humanitarian principles, new humanitarian purpose and objective. And it suggests 4 big changes. First, a new doctrine, a new ideology of humanity. Secondly, a new sense of impartiality and fairness and non-discrimination between humans and nature. And this means changes to humanitarian practice, new ways of working, and new organizations which combine humanity and nature in their objectives. So I'm arguing in the book that we need to create a nature-positive humanitarianism, an ecological humanitarianism. So let me explain a little for the next 15 minutes or so. So the first thing I do is I say we need to revise, we need to update our doctrine of humanity. The principle of humanity we use at the moment is from 1965. And it was really created for war, for the Red Cross, by the Swiss. And it is to alleviate human suffering wherever it may be found, to protect life and health, and ensure respect for the human being. And that is an amazing principle. And it has taken thousands of years for human beings to see each other equally as humans. And we just have to look at the history of slavery, the history of the oppression of women, the history of racism, and we can see that it was not simple for humanity to say we are all one. We are a common humanity. So that is a great moral, ethical achievement. And you know from your life every day that it is not yet finished, because people still don't see other humans as equal. So we need to change this, in my view. Although we realize we are a single moral community as humans across the whole earth, the danger of humanity is it imagines that we float above the earth as a separate species, a separate kind of animal that doesn't need the earth. We are humans. But this is not true. The Latin word for human comes from humus, meaning earth. We are from the earth. We don't float above it like gods. We are completely of the earth, part of the earth, dependent on the earth. There is no human life without other life. And we always live a hybrid life, a mixed life, a hyphenated life. So we are water humans, wheat humans, rice humans, air humans. In Kyiv, it seems we are dumpling humans as well. So we always live a hybrid life. And we need, in our doctrine of humanity and humanitarianism, to recognize this mutualism, that we are not just humans, we are humans mixed with, we live a mutual life with our environment. So we have to create the idea of humanity as an all-life ethic. We need all life to be human, and as humans, we love all life. We love our home, our earth, our nature. So in the Earth emergency, survival is always a joint project between humanity and nature. It is a kind of mutual aid where humans can save nature and nature can save humans. And every humanitarian knows this, because if you say to a humanitarian, how are you going to save a human life? They will say, I will plug it back in to nature, because I will give it food, I will give it water, I will give it shelter. And the way they save a human life is connecting it again to nature and the environment and the fruits of the environment. So, I argue in the book that we need to change the principle of humanity, and we need to recognize that all humanitarian work should be done in harmony with nature, recognizing the mutualism of humans and nature. And I argue for an ecological understanding of humanity. And I give 3 options for changing. The second thing, if I take nature seriously as part of my moral project, my practical project to save human lives, I have to change the principle of impartiality. And again, the principle of impartiality at the moment in humanitarian ideology is from 1965 as well, that there should be no discrimination between people by politics, by color, by age, by gender, etc. We should only look at people on the basis of need alone. And I say now, if nature is so important and we are part of nature and nature is part of our survival, then we must not discriminate against nature either. And we should recognize nature's needs. If nature is drying up, if its crops are drying, if the water is not there, if there is drought, if there is war destroying nature, we have to recognize nature's needs as well. So I extend humanitarian fairness to nature as well as humans. And we do this a lot. You do this a lot in your work already. When you are doing disaster risk reduction, you are trying to encourage nature to save lives. You are planting trees in Kyiv to make you cool in the summer, all sorts of things. You are trying to keep rivers alive for themselves and for you and for me. And we do this all the time. So these 2 ideological revisions to humanitarianism do 2 things. First of all, they recognize and value nature and other life. They make them important to us. And then secondly, they recognize that good humanitarianism means cooperating with nature as a partner. So that it says nature is a humanitarian partner to us because it can save us and we can save nature. So those are the big ethical changes I make. And then people say to me, Hugo, this is ridiculous. This is just stupid, isn't it? Because, you know, we cannot save every human life in Ukraine. We can't save every human life in Gaza. We can't save every human life in Sudan. And now you want us to think about nature and become ecological humanitarians. And I still say yes. For the 21st century, yes, I do. And most places are not as extreme as Gaza and Ukraine. Most places, people are trying to survive in their environment. In parts of Africa and Asia and Europe now, when we get heat waves and floods, we are trying to survive in our environment with nature. And I think this time when the whole humanitarian system is changing, the Americans have left, the money is short, we have a chance to change it and to work with others. So let me explain what I think we should do. And it's 4 things. So first, I think we should take a landscape approach to suffering, need, and response. So at the moment in the humanitarian system, the unit of analysis is people in need. They go around counting human bodies in need around the world. And every year they say there are 300 million people in need, P-I-N, people in need. And that's what they count. And I'm saying we need to change that to places in need. We need to look at landscapes in need, where humans and nature are suffering together, and they need to survive together with each other. And we should have an all-life assessment whenever we are assessing needs, and we should have an all-life response. The second thing I'm saying is that we cannot think from the past anymore. We have to embrace anticipation and adaptation. So when you are planning as humanitarians, increasingly what happened 10, 20, 30 years ago is not so important, because the earth is changing and we will see things that were not before. So we need to plan and respond anticipating what is going to happen in these environments from the science we know. And we need to do more anticipatory aid, where we say, we know in 3 months' time, 4 months' time, that civilian population, it will be under fire from the Russians, it will be being attacked, but also we know that hot weather is coming, it's going to be hotter, there will be less food. We have to anticipate with science that we can see the environmental future as well. And then we must help people adapt. We cannot just help people exactly to be the same as before, because as the earth and the weather and the situation changes, that's not help. We need to help them adapt, change, find new ways of living in their environment as it changes. And then the third thing we need to do this, we need new integrated organizations. And I'm pleased to see CARE here, because I know CARE a little. We need organizations that think about humans and nature together, that think about humans and the environment. And they balance ecological expertise and humanitarian expertise. And they look at the landscape around people, and they work to support all life in that place. We need organizations like that. We need to rewrite the mandates of organizations, and we need to remake organizations that mix humanitarian, ecological expertise in the climate emergency, in the earth emergency. This will be cheaper, because at the moment we have so many human-only organization, nature-only organization. They work in parallel. They have different bureaucracies, different things. It's expensive. We need to crash them together and develop long-term and humanitarian thinking around places. And the fourth thing we need to do, which is difficult, because you know in your humanitarian work, when you work with children or when you work with women or when you work with a displaced community, you want them to represent themselves. You say, we want them to speak for what they need. We want them to speak up, come to the table and say, this is our experience. This is how we feel, what we suffer. This is what we need from you. If you take nature seriously, you have to find a way to listen to rivers, to the air, to forests, to crops, to landscapes. You have to find a way to bring nature to the table and say what it needs and what it can do to save life. And that is challenging, but there are ways all around the world at the moment in New Zealand, in Africa, in Ecuador. And there's two ways to do this. First, you can ask humans to be guardians and the human face of nature. So, for example, in New Zealand, the Maoris have appointed a committee of people to be the human face of a river, which is now a protected river. And they can represent it in parliament, they can represent it in different ways, to speak for the river. The other way is that, like humans, you give nature rights. So in the way that the best way to establish people's needs and freedoms was human rights, we can say we need the rights of nature. So there's a big movement in Europe and America and probably in Ukraine as well for the rights of nature. And in some countries like Ecuador and Bolivia, the rights of nature are in the country's constitution, that the rights of nature must be taken seriously in any decision that involves. And then you have to negotiate human rights and the rights of nature together, legally somehow. It's funny how whenever we change things in the world, there's always more jobs for lawyers. But that's the reality, so there will be more jobs. So those are the four things: a landscape approach, future-facing planning, new integrated organizations that mix ecology and humanitarianism, and the challenge of bringing nature to the table. And that is Humanitarianism 2.0. That is what I'm saying we need for the 21st century, for the humanitarianism of the Earth emergency we face. And now you can tell me if this is all stupid in Ukraine or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this powerful speech. And now we have time for some discussion. And it was very relevant that you said right now about this listening. And we had yesterday with Mila conversation, and we have a lot of conversation, of course, but I have this privilege to ask first question, and after that you will continue. I want to ask you about local actors, because we had this conversation, how we can be heard in the world, and how we can talk about our traumatic experience correctly, and how we can speak and influence to some changes in the humanitarian system. Maybe I know it's very hard to answer directly, and we don't have magic pills, but you have a lot of experience, and maybe you can give us some good advice what we can do.
Does this work as well? No? Thank you. It's a great question, representation. How can your voice be heard? Ukraine has done very, very well at making its voice heard. Your president, your diplomacy, your diplomats, your embassies. And you have been very clever the way that we all know your flag. You have branded yourself with the yellow and blue. We know who you are, we know your struggle, you have made it simple. And that is great representation, great communication. And you have been challenging and informative and encouraging and thankful in equal measure. So it's very strong representation. Everybody knows who you are now and what you need. And what you can do, that's the other thing. People really know what Ukrainians can do as well. So thinking about nature, I think we need the same. I mean, I've argued that we need embassies for nature in Geneva, in New York. Maybe we need them in Kyiv. And nature needs to be represented. So in a United Nations conference, in a meeting on the SDGs, or in a meeting on humanitarian aid, like next door now, nature can get up and the diplomat for nature can speak in some way about the condition of nature. And of course, that's very difficult because it sounds easy, but that leaves the representation and the interests of nature in human hands. And that means that there is power there is possibility for manipulation, for exploitation, etc. But if you look at the last few hundred years of politics, the big questions in politics is how new types of human being are represented politically. And in a way, it starts with people who were enslaved, how they represent their voice, and then they become free and recognized fully as humans. And then we have it with women even. It's hard for your generation to imagine, but women had no voice, women had no representation, women could not work in the public space, etc. Gradually, women's voice came and became represented and heard politically. And then the same with children, if you like. Children had no voice, and gradually children are represented by others, speaking for them, and then law is made around them, and then they are encouraged to speak themselves politically. And this is how things changed. And most recently, in a way, you could say disabled people have made the same progress. They have come out being politically recognized. There is a UN convention on the rights of people with disabilities, etc. They now have political space, political representation. And I think we need to follow this process somehow with nature as well, so that in 50 years' time, when you are old like me, you will think it normal that somehow nature speaks in human politics. I don't know how you'll do it. You can do it by law, or you can do it by imagining what it's like to be nature and trying to speak imaginatively, like the poets have always done for nature. Or we may find ways with AI and other things to hear nature.
Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, we will have a discussion. I wanted to take microphone and give you, and I want to ask you to do a quick introduction. When you will have some comments or questions, please do this. And I also want to say we will collect our thoughts and we will share this with our community. So please, okay.
Thank you, Hugo. It's very, very powerful what you think, and it's very, very relevant for me. So I'm Alexandra Buglak. I represent Humanitarian NGO platform, so a lot of organization. But I suddenly ended up in humanitarian coordination. So actually, I am from environmental protection. I have PhD on this, and I just want to maybe answer your question: is it relevant for Ukraine or no? Because for me, when it's more reflection rather than question, or maybe you can suggest in the end something for me or for us as community. So when I joined the humanitarian response, for me, especially in coordination, was very huge and obvious a gap about lack of understanding how everything interconnected. So to give you some examples, what I mean that I usually talk about that contact line. It's not reflect geology and other sources. So for example, it is already a couple of research that like we have a coal mines on occupied territories, which not reflect contact line. And it's great like to skip the whole process, how it's happening, but it is create pollution of the potable water in the end. And the people become people in need, and it's humanitarian overload. The other examples, it's more bureaucratical, but it's about also cities who is coal mining in contact lines where it is evacuation happening. And the coal miners have exemption from mobilization. And they don't want to be evacuated because then they lost their exemption and they become humanitarian. So this is two examples about how we usually focus here in Ukraine in humanitarian response only to cover, and I don't say it's not needed, but like to cover only immediate needs, but not to think how these needs happen beyond the just bombing and everything. So the impact of war, it's much deeper and deeper to humanitarians. Same as it is a research from, I believe, Swedish Red Cross about how waste on humanitarian aids produced. So like to deliver aid, it's enormous pollutions to the environment because of the packages and so on and so far. So like it's a huge impact on this. And for me, what is really, really missing here in Ukraine, it's exactly this understanding of interconnection to go on beyond the like, where is the people in need, how many people in need. But sometimes it's need not only because of the bombing, it's deeper because of the deeper things. And maybe last comment, it's also about the demining, impact of demining on environmental, or in general about the pollution of air after, like recently in Kiev, the quality of air is enormous. But also the, again, demining and the pollution of the soil. So it is polluted soil, and it is, again, you can find research which is interesting how the heavy metals polluted soil, soil polluted the grain, grain polluted animals who ate it, and especially taking into account that Ukraine is a third country still on the export of the wheat. So I don't want to say it, but I still doubt how much we measure pollution of the heavy metals in the grain we export all over the world. So it means that like Ukrainian war, it's not only about Ukrainians who is dying, it's really like touch to everyone in the world who use any Ukrainian products and so on. So for me, it's more about to give your thoughts about this interconnection, how to implement it. So what is the advocacy should be done that we can push here actors in Ukraine to find the sources for this, or to think more intersectorial, let's say. Thank you.
Now, I agree with that. Is this working now?
Yes.
Yeah, great. It's jolly heavy. So I agree with that. And it is all interconnected. And I think it's very clear that Ukraine's environment has been attacked, and Ukraine's nature has been invaded and attacked and hurt and harmed as well in the Russian invasion. So I think you have to take this seriously. And of course, in the Geneva Conventions, in international humanitarian law, nature, the environment, is recognized as civilian. It is recognized with civilian status. So the environment has always to be protected in the same way as civilians. And there has to be very good military reasons for damaging nature. And nature is protected in the Geneva Conventions because itself, it is beautiful and we need it, and it is innocent. It is not harming people. But it is also protected because it is, this is legal phrase, indispensable for the survival of the civilian human population. So you're right, if the fields are polluted, if the wheat is polluted, if rivers are polluted and destroyed and dams are burst deliberately, then nature is under attack. And I think, how do you deal this, you say? I mean, I would say that you have a long war in your country, and hopefully it will end soon, but even if it ends, the legacy of the war will be long on humans and on nature. So I would suggest you start planning now and using ecological humanitarianism, where you care about human life and nature at the same time. You argue in the law and in human rights and environmental protection for the protection of all life in Ukraine, not just human life, the life of nature as well. And you take this strategic integrated approach, this interconnected approach in your advocacy, in your work, and in the way you talk about your humanitarian challenge. That would be my view.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Daria. I'm from CARE. So first of all, thank you very much for recalling CARE's work, and I hope we will start more environmental programs with CARE Ukraine as well. And the question I wanted to ask is kind of building up a little bit on what Alexandra mentioned in the end, on how what's happening in Ukraine with the war in Ukraine can actually and is actually already crossing a lot of borders, and how, for example, the occupation of 1,000 lands and what happened to the Kakhovka Dam, so the destruction of this massive dam in 2023 actually affected a lot of countries and raised the overall level of hunger, unfortunately, in the world, because we exported so much. And the consequences of that are actually immeasurable. So we even don't know how, how deep and how long the consequences of that would be. So my question was more about how you mentioned how you imagine transformation of the principles of humanity and impartiality. But when we're talking about the response to a global threat and global challenge like that, and when we see examples like what's happening in Ukraine affecting a lot of African countries, for example, what do we do with the principle of neutrality? How do we approach that? And I really hope that you wouldn't think that you would get away from this room without having a question about neutrality. I'm sorry for that, but how do we approach that? How do we argue? So my position is I'm an advocacy advisor. How do we argue with the governments? How do we argue with international decision makers for them to sit down and actually agree among themselves, all having different visions, that this is something that we need to address collectively?
Yeah, it's another great question and complicated. So the first thing on, thinking about care, thinking about all your organizations, I don't know what each of you do, but, if you take an ecological humanitarian approach, then in this day and age, the important thing is that you don't just ask for humanitarian money. So, I think agencies like CARE and the UN and others are saying, oh, we've got no money in humanitarianism now, we must shrink our objectives. We must just care about very basic needs of human beings. We must make humanitarianism smaller and smaller. And I'm saying, no, this is the wrong moment in history to make humanitarianism smaller. You need to make it bigger. And then you need to say, we want climate money, we want nature money, we want humanitarian money, we want money from everything because we are responding ecologically as well as humanitarian. So I think it's a time where you can, in Ukraine, you could start redefining humanitarianism and saying, no, Geneva was good in the 20th century, but humanitarianism today should be Kievian, Ukrainian humanitarianism, which recognizes that nature and people are under attack, and we need to help all of it. So I would redefine it. On neutrality, the lovely thing about writing this book is that I ignored neutrality. I didn't have to write about it. I couldn't be bothered anymore because I've said what I think about neutrality, and I'm not a total humanitarian. I'm not a humanitarian fundamentalist. I think that if you're a Ukrainian humanitarian, of course you're not neutral about being attacked and hurt and invaded. If I'm a British humanitarian, of course I'm not neutral about being attacked and humanitarian. What I admire about Ukrainian Red Cross, which is your organization I know best, is that they are with the people and with Ukraine in their work. But then internationally, they're respectful. They don't cause great trouble in international meetings and things like that. They will work with their brother and sister Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations. So there's a balance, I think. But the challenge with nature is that in a way, nature is neutral, it's free, it's not in our politics in a way. But then people can take power over nature, and then it's not neutral. They can use it as a weapon. They can use it to attack or to defend, and then they instrumentalize nature. And of course, the very process of making nature human property means that it's not neutral anymore, and it becomes leveraged into human politics. So it's a question I avoided in the book, but maybe I'll have to look at it later. But yeah, in general, my view on humanitarian neutrality is that it's important for the Swiss to try and be neutral because they want to be neutral all the time. But I'm British, I don't want to be neutral all the time. And I'm quite happy that I can be a humanitarian by living to the principle of humanity and trying to care for humans and nature who are hurt. And I will do that impartially. So if my enemy is hurt in front of me, I will respond to them with humanity. But I won't agree with them. But I'm British, we're a bit different, some of us. So.
Thank you.
My name is Anton Shevchenko. I'm with the Ukrainian Red Cross. First of all, thank you, sir, for this tremendous presentation. And I've got a question for you, elaborating a little bit on the first one. As we are adapting our mindsets to this more like climate and ecologically conscious approaches, what kind of practical approach should we take in terms of adapting the international humanitarian law frameworks in this regard? Because you mentioned previously a certain limitation, which is contingent upon any harm to the nature in the course of hostilities as correlational to military necessity, right? But here in Ukraine, we may witness a really wide range of these empirical cases from, say, an invading arms carrier removing the vegetation in a border area to be able to launch these wired drones. Let's say more of like a local scale manifestation to these so-called landscape devastation occurrences with a quite articulated intention to undermine these very humus, as you powerfully posited it, the connection of the people with their area, with their ecosystem, with their environment. So it becomes unrecognizable, and for them, once they are pushed out, displaced by the hostilities, very different to in terms of like return, potential return, etc. So my question is, what particular action can be taken realistically at this point, based on our lessons learned in Ukraine, to adapt the existing international humanitarian law frameworks, and specifically in terms of these principles of military necessity, proportionality, distinction, etc. Thank you.
That's really interesting, you know, how you act with proportionality to nature and other things. It's really important. I mean, there's a lot of good law already in the Geneva Conventions, and ICRC did do a very good report on the environmental aspects of IHL and guidelines for the military. So there's a lot done with the current law. But I think, you know, when I was writing this book, one of the big turning points for me is when I read the first ever all life needs assessment that I had ever read after a disaster. So the Australians had really terrible wildfires, I think in 2017, something like that. And those wildfires devastated huge areas of forest. And I think for the first time in environmental history, really systematically, their ecologists, after the fire, they went and analyzed and assessed the impact on every species that had lived there. Tree, vegetation, bird, mammal, insect, everything. And they produced this astonishing all-life assessment of the fire. And it's one of the few times in my life that when I was reading it, I was almost crying, because the list of devastation and animal displacement, habitat destruction for hundreds of species, etc., was really moving. It's really, really tragic and sad. And I think in a sense, that's the first thing you can do in Ukraine in a way, is you could possibly really do a biodiversity, and maybe you have, because you're brilliant people, a biodiversity assessment of the invasion and the war. And not just human suffering, but animal suffering, animal change. Of course, one of the things you'll find is that some habitats will have benefited. They may have rewilded in some way because they are beyond the place. So there may be some positive news, but the majority is about an attack on nature. And I think that would be a very powerful report to take to the Biodiversity Convention in Yerevan in Armenia next year. If Ukraine as a country said, we want to submit this biodiversity assessment of suffering and damage to the biodiversity because of the Ukraine war, or something like that. I don't know, things like that, but I'm not sure how much you can change the law. Where the law is being changed is by Kate McIntosh, who's ex-MSF, very senior British barrister. And she's working very hard on ecocide, to recognize the crime of ecocide in international law. So that's not changing existing IHL, it's doing a sort of genocide convention for nature. And I think, maybe a Ukrainian contribution could support that somehow. But, I think until people see it with their own eyes and realize the attack on nature, it's hard to imagine. So you have to represent it first, if that helps.
Thank you. We have another question. A second.
Thank you so much. I will ask you in Ukrainian if you want.
Okay, hang on. I got mine.
Okay, I will then it's I'll make it easier. I'm Tatiana Rabakin. I'm head of external relations of Caritas Ukraine.
Oh, good.
And I used to be SMT member for the Worldwide Fund in Ukraine for quite many years. So when I first heard the announcement of you coming and the ideas that you researched and reveal, I felt we are in the right place, and I'm very thankful you're here. I couldn't even expect. I wanted to reflect on some things that you said and maybe reflect on some questions from the audience, from my colleagues. And the first one is on the last one, as you said, the crime against the nature is already well documented in Ukraine, especially through environmental NGOs and the Ministry of Environmental Affairs. And Ukraine is a signatory for the Convention on Biodiversity. Unfortunately, they are quite al dente, as we say, on some reactions, but it's already present as a scientific, evidence-based and research, and sometimes with the life-threatening efforts from the environmentalists who are trying to be closer to the spots that's been damaged. Because it was a question, how do we connect these things? And there are a couple of issues and a couple of ideas that I have and wanted to share. First of all, I want to remind us that we have quite a strong environmental community. And because I come from these environmental NGOs, I could compare they are much less powerful than the humanitarian community. And the amount of funding that they receive, including WTBF in Ukraine, is immensely less than for the humanitarian organizations, especially during this fierce stage of the crisis. And they have good impacts, but not enough impact on on providing this needed voice to the nature. Although they've been doing this and doing this really forcefully and with all devotion in Ukraine, there's lots of knowledge there. So this is the point we had to get contacts, drink coffee together, and looking into the shared possibilities. That's probably one of the points to start. In Ukraine, there's a good basis for and research done in adaptation for so-called nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions is a notion that was created specifically to make people who are more economic thinkers and who are more thinking about owning nature, to make them think that nature is really a stakeholder. And the whole notion of ecosystem services and how we can, so to use nature in their terms more, to use nature, we have to be friends, we have to be partners at least. And we have a good research into the nature-based solutions in Ukraine, for example, on how to adapt to the climate change, on how to help the rivers and have best access to water. And this is actually the same question that humanitarians have. How do we create the long-term access to water? And this is where Caritas Ukraine and my colleague Tetiana from head of a WASH program is now looking together with WWF on how we could resolve short-term issues with water, and also looking together with communities on the long-term solutions. And this is where, for example, both types of NGOs come together and finding this voice together and have the tools to join. And this is an interesting experience, actually, and I believe it will lead somewhere, for sure. And maybe to start, we need a bit of education. We don't have time for a profound education in biodiversity as humanitarians, but we need some, just to have this grasp, to have this attitude, to really to have this reason to believe, I would say. And this is where we could look at together as well, and also ask the environmental community help us. And I remember us writing in the beginning of the war, everyone started speaking about the recovery, including an environmental, although because we didn't believe the war would take so long. And we had a report, a research with Boston Consulting Group on the recovery, and we provided advice to different sectors of economic on how to start recovery. And one of the first lines was to use the principle of do less harm, not completely no harm, because sometimes you cannot allow that, afford this, but do less harm. And opening this notion could be the starting point. How can we do less harm? Because it's all individual. These are not very universal approaches in our situation to every point of crisis. So this is, I believe this is it. And thank you for provoking this thinking and being with us.
Tetiana, thanks. It's lovely that you're here. And I really admire what Caritas has done on water in Ukraine, because that was the first time I really saw it coming through my social media in UK, which was great. And I totally agree with you. I mean, when I started as a humanitarian in the 1980s, we actually worked quite a lot with environmental agencies at the same time. And then in the 90s, humanitarians went on their own trip, and said, oh, we're the great protectors of the human individual, we're the great protector of every human being. And they sort of forgot a lot of that. And I really agree with you that the two communities must be brought together now to meet and know each other. And I'm sure in the CSO Alliance, you are all mixed in, so you have a good opportunity to know each other. And then to start a new form of combined practice. I agree with you about that. And I think that would be exciting and bring finance and political attention from different directions onto landscapes and things. So I hope it works. And in fact, in Geneva, I met the former head of WWF, an Italian called Marco Lambertini, who was very nice. He read this in advance and said, actually, it's quite cool. And he wrote on the back. And he said the same thing. He said, we never meet each other. We never work with each other. So we're trying to have a meeting in Geneva where we push together both communities as well. And the International Federation of the Red Cross has made an agreement with WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, to work in 5 areas together in the world. And I think CARE had a memorandum of understanding. So the more, I think, in Ukraine, you can work together, environmental humanitarians together, and produce a new approach, a new understanding of human and nature suffering, the better. That's great. You're here.
Thank you.
Well, my name is Alexandra Andreeva, and I'm from Spivria. And actually, as an international lawyer myself primarily, I have a question regarding, because we all mentioned a lot of frameworks today here, and we all know that the credibility right now and the enforcement, especially of certain declarations like Rio and all the other ones, is under threat, I would say. So specifically, knowing that we are really interested in creating new frameworks, in advancing and connecting them. Usually we come to the perspectives that comes again back to the 50s, I would say, when we create a global framework that is technically adaptive, but not so much, that should be enforceable, but it's not entirely like erga omnes or international custom. So it's usually up to the states to actually follow them like bona fide. So my question here is, because even ecocide was traditionally offered, like the definition by Vanuatu, so it's indigenous community. So my question basically is, for many Ukrainians on land, on site, it is all about the indigenous knowledge that we want to bring. But if we create another framework or we adapt the existing framework on the global level, how can we make sure that the indigenous knowledge is actually represented? How can we make sure that the real practical understanding, and I'm really glad you mentioned the river representation and a lot of cases, especially in international, like the American Commission for Human Rights, because they started talking about that, especially in Colombia, for instance. And it's wonderful to see, but it has a backlash. So yeah, my question here, as Ukrainians, we've done a lot of work and we're gonna push back, especially on all these kinds. But in the end, how we make sure that the indigenous communities can actually have a say in the adapting what is up there globally or on the level of the nation on the side. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's a really good point. I thought you were a lawyer because every time I mentioned the law, you went, and I was thinking, oh no, what if she goes like this? I mean, I think interestingly, I mean, it's up to you in Ukraine how you give political space to your indigenous peoples and how you allow them to talk and set the agenda. That's for your politics, and you have to work that out. And I really agree with you that there is this pushback now. I mean, there's a pushback from sort of a resurgent conservatism. There's a pushback against environment, against women's rights, against all sorts of things. So you're going to just have to stand in the face of that pushback and keep moving forwards and holding your ground. So you need to work with them here, however you do it. I'm sure you do it well. And then the good thing about the Biodiversity Convention is that indigenous people are really at the heart of it. So they can be marginalized from the Paris Agreement track. They can be marginalized from other tracks. But in the Biodiversity Convention, they're really there and they're really present. So again, I think internationally, that's your best route, probably. But I don't know enough about Ukraine to really advise you, but I think you just have to work with them in a way like Tatiana said. You need to come together and work with particular landscapes and communities and give them voice and give examples of new ways of working. Yeah, but it's a really important point. And it is a difficult moment in international multilateralism in law. But often those moments are ultimately creative. Because if we're lucky, we'll get some sort of change and breakthrough. And so you have to hold on, I think, and keep producing data, keep making arguments.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Slim. I'm Jim Hickman. I work in public health and development, or at least I did until the program fell through. So if you need to hire a crazy American, please come see me. This is my third war zone. My first was in Rwanda in 1994. And I remember very distinctly a Frenchman saying, the environment is the very first thing that goes by the wayside, the very first thing that is forgotten. So thank you for bringing this to our attention. My question is twofold, and you're welcome to answer either or both. You spoke of humans being of the earth and the humanity and the physical. I was wondering if you addressed the psychological, and my questions are, what psychology can we use to motivate governments to address this? And then my second question may be harder, but the world seems to be going insane the past few days. And I was wondering, do you have suggestions, and how do yourself stay sane with everything that's going on? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm sure you're not a crazy American, and we don't need another one. So what we need is a good, sensible American. I think I think it's a really interesting question, and of course we're all familiar with it, the relationship between nature and emotional health and happiness and joy. And I think we all know from our poets, from our writers, from our songs, from our experience of walking down a road when the birds are singing and the sun's out, we know ourselves that we are emotionally part of nature as well. And that's part of the beautiful thing about life. So I think we can, each one of us, start from there. I think religions have a big part to play in this, because I think, you know, still the majority of the world is religious in a way. And I think religious people can speak very powerfully of it in very moral terms, which, you know, don't need international law. They just speak about what's right and, you know, what God wants and what God is and where God is. And for a lot of people, that becomes very meaningful. So I think there's a role that religious people can play much, much more in the earth emergency, in the nature emergency. And I think, I mean, there's two things to your questions in a sense. How can we use psychology to motivate and mobilize politicians to take the environment seriously? Well, I think that is about song, about religious leaders, about political pressure, about the sort of political lobbying of beauty, if you like, on politicians. I think it's generational as well. I think if young people who are the majority really stand up for nature and say they love it and they want to be part of it, that will affect politics, I hope, again. And then the second part of your question is how nature is good for us. It makes us happier, better. And I think there's a lot of progress on that now. And, you know, Tetiana mentioned nature-based solutions, but there's a lot of work going on in Britain, certainly, about nature-based solutions to mental health and anxiety and sadness and happiness. And so nature is seen as a real remedy, a force of healing for us. And so I think you're right to notice the psychological, emotional, spiritual dimension of nature. Because, of course, we found God in nature long before we found God in more complicated, elaborate ideologies. And that's probably where God still is, quite a lot.
Thank you. We have some online guests, and probably some of them want to say something or no? No? Okay. Okay, so maybe...
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Hugo has this headphones, so it can be in Ukrainian. We still have a couple minutes, so maybe last comments. Okay.
I have such maybe a provocative one, because we now speak about all this nature, climate in a very theoretical way. Yes, about how it's in science, how it's in books, how it's in universities, for example. But we live now in Ukraine here, and we saw a lot of different crimes that Russia already did. For example, with our Kakhovka dam, with destroying and killing animals in shelters, or even in our national reserve Askania Nova, they killed very rare species and they eat them. And it's happening now. And for me, for example, here I can understand if there all organizations in United States, in Britain, in Europe, all over the world, if they care about it, because we don't see any reaction. And it's also about that nature. It's not only about that we need to protect it. It's also about that we need to think that it's also can be a part of war, like a weapon, when it's like with rivers, with Kakhovka Dam and all such sort of things. So if now, not in theoretical way, but in very practical way, in a war, what is happening in all the scientific, not scientific circles in Europe with NGOs, what they think about it. And it's really, have they any reactions or no? Because here we can see it.
So thank you. So I think, I mean, I'm not hearing those messages, particularly in the UK, about atrocities against nature, apart from the dam. That's the one we knew about. But I think, as I was saying earlier, the more you can raise the level of information and detail that this is a war against nature as well as humans, I think that's very important, because every war is a war on nature as well. And this one has specific, deliberate characteristics as well. I think the other thing to understand about Europe at the moment is that, certainly in Britain, everybody loves animals and they get very upset when there's animal cruelty. So they will always respond to that, often more than human cruelty. In some ways, it's easier to be an animal NGO in UK than a human NGO. So that's the British mentality. But, in Europe at the moment, people are worried about themselves. I said at the beginning that the climate emergency is a long emergency. It's universal. And people are now worrying about their own poverty, that they're going to be flooded, there's going to be heat waves. They're worried about changes in our own society. So that the level in the attention economy, there is no doubt that the attention economy in Europe is much more focused on Europe. It's worrying about the geopolitics. It's saying, are we all going to become poorer? Are we going to be squeezed between a hostile Russia and possibly a uncaring or hostile US? So the attention has changed a lot since the start of the war, certainly in 2014 and then the major invasion in 2022. So, I think you have to understand that Europeans will always be there to help because they feel real interest and care about Ukraine. But to get their attention is going to be more and more difficult because of their feelings of crisis and danger and thinking more about themselves at the moment. And the fact that we have a political struggle of our own. So, if I talk about Britain, we have a major new party now, which is more right-wing, and the same in Germany, the same in Holland and the Netherlands. So everyone's thinking, gosh, what's happening to our own society? It's a different challenge of attention now.
Thank you. Maybe last question or comments. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Leila, Charitable Foundation Postmishka.ua. My question and reflection is, before the full-scale invasion, I lived in Bakhmut, it's Donetsk region. If you know, the war came into Donbass a bit earlier. So I lived near the front line, and area of my responsibility was agriculture as well. And I saw a lot of issues that farmers faced with after missiles, after mines. They tried to demine, they paid a lot of money for demining to cultivate lands, etc., etc. But I saw the worst consequences, and it wasn't about war. It was about, I think it's transnational corporations, which polluted with the pesticides the earth. And when you go through the field of sunflower, you don't hear any noise because everything killed. Every rats, rabbits, or insects, it was killed. So my question is, it's not well known for big cities and for people who don't live in agriculture regions, but I saw points of allergics, a lot of allergy from child allergy and different consequences of this pollution. And my question is, what your suggestion for advocating not only about war consequences, but about these transnational corporations that I think, in my opinion, killed Ukrainians as well every day and not during the war.
It's a really important point, Leila. I mean, the first thing I would say is that if, as an agriculturalist, I think makes you an ideal ecological humanitarian, if you like. You have great skills for that and understanding of the relationship between humans and landscape. But on your bigger question, it comes back to where we started with Mariana's question about interconnectedness. And, you know, there's no doubt that when we talk about the earth emergency and the nature emergency, we are not just talking about climate change. You know, the biodiversity treaty makes it very clear that the nature emergency is as much about pollution, pesticides, things you're talking about, and bad land management by human beings as it is about climate change. So it's up to you in your own organizations how far you take the connectedness. And if you want to be an environmental organization that works on humanitarian dimensions too, or whatever. But you're absolutely right that it's not just war, it's not just climate. It's pesticides, business, pollution, agricultural capitalism, etc., that is damaging the world. And then you have to work out how you talk about this and where you focus your energy. But you're right, you shouldn't stop being concerned about that during a war. You know, a lot of really important things happen in societies at war. You know, from British experience, we know that, you know, you can get great progress in labor relations, in labor unions during a war because there's more consensus to talk about the worker and work. And it might be the same with agriculture. You could get new consensus about what is a positive way of agriculture and what is a negative one. It opens up the chance for national conversation, sometimes. But you're right.
Thank you. And we have another question.
Hello, my name is Natalia. I work in media and in civil sector. And recently I've prepared an article about tragedy in Kakhovka Dam. And as for me, international community doesn't understand the consequence of the war because live organisms like mollusks, fish, they don't listen people or people low. They live their own life. And for example, one example, when it was water without salt, and these waters went to salt, to sea, and some fishes either migrate, either died. And this is like chain reaction, a trophy chain, its name. And probably mines from Ukraine, they can go to Côte d'Azur. Sometimes I spend time in France, and when somebody will be swimming and will be explosion, because some fish eat something and bring there. So it seems to me I want to support my colleagues that we should be more loud in our stance about this tragedy, which now almost forgotten. In media, in NGO, nobody speaks about, but it's like civilization crime. And I wanted to support my another colleague, which says that, for example, we should go against agricultural capitalism, because, for example, in Soviet Union, which is now treated as total evil in local collective farm, it was a practice of change land for different, for corn, for wheat, for potato. It was not the same kind of plant all time, because it's not very good for soil. And so it seems to me that, yes, in this context, your book is very important, and voice of Ukraine should be loud, because we now have very tragedy practice, but we know we accumulated much information and much researches. Thank you.
Those are very strong points, and I agree with that. And it comes back to the point about the attention economy. So we, in Europe, what we hear the dam bursting, we hear the damage, we see the damage, but probably only for 2 or 3 days. Okay, then it's gone from us. So we never hear the long story of the complete tragedy for nature. And the way you describe it to me sounds like ecocide. It sounds like the deliberate destruction of an ecosystem. And we never quite hear the end of that story, but you must tell it, and it's really good you've written these articles, and it's really important. So I don't know, I asked, at the beginning, would this be relevant in Ukraine, or would it be crazy and irrelevant because you're trying to save human beings? And I think it's relevant. Yeah, and it seems, as usual with Ukrainians, you're in advance of me, and you were doing it anyway. And yeah, I was just sitting in Oxford thinking and writing, but you were already forming ecological NGOs, civil society, having ideas, pushing agendas. So well done. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have Mila.
Thank you so much. I see the faces, and I think it's really very important and warm and interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Hugo. I think we will have here break, then we will back and we will present the ecosystem. But I know that you have books here, and so how we?
I should give one to Tetiana Caritas. There. Has she got one? I don't know how to do the other one. Yeah, but I don't know how we do it. I mean,
Please, because
okay. Oh, they can't hear me. There you are. I have one because Ola was so kind to me, but I don't know how we do the other ones. I think the journalist has to have one, and I must not discriminate against men, so that the man has to have one. And then I'm going to give one to Leila, I think, the agriculturalist, and then I think the lawyer, no? Yeah, Alexandra, yeah. And I can write if you want, but then the main, or you can read them. Yeah.
Also, what makes sense, and it will be even sound maybe not pushing. I don't want to say pushing, yes, because it will be some good words would encourage to do something.
I hope so.
And then open your book in somewhere and read this, and maybe you will find some answers. We have some when you could read, and then it could be like your guidance. Maybe it will be, but I'm sure this book will be guide. So. Let's do break and breakfast. I don't know, some food and some lunch, and then we will back. Ola, when at maybe 20 minutes? Yes, in 20 minutes we could back, and then because I know that we need to care about your work time as well. So, but I'm sure that it will be very important to have another conversation
Thank
here.
you. Thank you, Ola. Thank you.